devo aspettare ancora un attimo.
Un po' sovrana la situazione, vediamo la cosa.
Scusate, ma posso cominciare o aspettiamo un secondo? C'è un... Scusate, ma è una serata un po' anomala rispetto alle altre per via di questo Natale che cambia tutto, l'atmosfera è diversa e anche le modalità sono un pochino diverse. Però forse possiamo cominciare e voglio cominciare dicendo che è passato un anno da quando abbiamo presentato la prima opera e le cose cominciano, insomma, le cose che abbiamo fatto che avevamo pensato cominciano a prendere corpo. Penso che girando lo studio lo si veda e spero che non solo lo si veda ma che lo si senta anche, perché non si tratta soltanto delle opere che sono esposte, che sono state acquisite, ma anche di una serie di altre cose che stiamo facendo, da questi incontri alle borse di studio di cui parleremo poi. Adesso vorrei introdurre Zineb Sedira, che è seduta qui vicino a me e di cui abbiamo alcune opere, 3 fotografie al piano di sopra. Penso che le abbiate viste. Zineb Sedira parlerà di se stessa, quindi cercherò di non parlare io, semmai poi le faremo qualche domanda. Voglio soltanto dire che è venuta a trovarci, è arrivata oggi da Londra, riparte domani mattina. Non è cresciuta a Londra ma è cresciuta in Francia. Non si definisce semplicemente francese, è algerina, e tutto questo per dire che il viaggio, il trasferimento e questo essere tra è l'elemento forse fondamentale del suo lavoro. Ecco, parlerà lei del lavoro, e poi dopo che lei avrà raccontato un po' di sé potremo appunto fare qualche domanda, e poi c'è un'altra cosa abbastanza speciale, ed è che qui fra voi c'è una serie di persone, di artisti che sono venuti questa sera perché hanno ricevuto una borsa di studio nctm, la borsa di studio per la prima edizione di questo bando che consente ad artisti che abbiano ricevuto un invito da residenze fuori dall'Italia di partire, di partecipare e quindi di usufruire di un periodo di formazione. Alcuni appunto sono già partiti e tornati ed altri partiranno fra poco, e alcuni di loro sono qui, li presenteremo fra poco. Qui ci sono Giancarlo Norese, Emilio Fantin, che hanno ricevuto la borsa di studio passata, che appunto già sono tornati, Leone Contini, Nathaniel Katz e Sabina Grasso, che invece partiranno fra poco, quindi poi vedremo anche loro, ma lascerei subito spazio a Zineb.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for coming. At this stage, when I do presentation of my work, I never know really where to start, because I don't know how much people know about the work, so whether I should repeat or not. But I think I will start perhaps with one important element, which is a biographical, and you'll understand through the work that I'll be showing you that it's important to know, basically, in order to understand the work. So a lot of my work has to do with movement and mobility, travels and immigration. Immigration because my parents immigrated from Algeria to France in the 60s, and then I immigrated to England in 86. So I've been in London for quite some time now. So a lot of the work has been informed by this idea of movement from one place to the other. Another important element, in 91 I became a mother. I gave birth to my first child in England, and I'm not just saying that to tell my life, but a lot of the work, or the early work, was informed with this idea of transmission, how as a mother, I felt at one point it was very important to transmit to my children the language spoken in the family, but also the stories. Obviously, and I will start with actually exactly this piece called Mother Tongue. Mother Tongue talks about my mother and my daughter and myself. And my mother was born in Algeria and speaks Arabic. I was born in France, speaking French. French is my mother tongue. My daughter was born in England, in London, and she speaks English. So I wanted to make a piece how within one family you have three languages, and how those languages travel with the movement, or with this idea of displacement. And I kind of ended up calling it a diasporic language, because the way now we speak to each other in the family is that we each other speak in our mother tongue to each other. So, just to be clear, my mom will speak in Arabic to me, and I will respond in French. I will talk to my daughter in French, and she will respond in English. So that's something that happened naturally, and I believe it happens to a lot of family that comes from this experience of traveling from one place to the other. That doesn't mean I don't speak Arabic, but it's just easier for me, because my mother tongue is French, to respond back to my mother in French while she speaks to me. So basically in the video you can see those three conversations happening in each mother tongues. But something happens on the third screen, which is my mother and my daughter, therefore grandmother and granddaughter. So, where one generation, which is me, has kind of jumped out in some ways, where both of them, therefore my mother and my daughter, can't communicate anymore. They try to speak to each other, one in English, the other one in Arabic, and there is not possibility of language anymore. And you see it in the video because they keep looking back towards the camera, because they just, they talk to each other and they don't understand. So they keep looking at the camera, and obviously I'm behind the camera, so you understand that kind of I become the translator or the interpreter, or that link between them two. So this work got me really interested in transmission and oral history. In Arabic culture, and especially in Algeria, I believe the passing on of the story, the transmission, happens through women, through mothers often, whether it's learning cooking, anything really, any tradition will be passed on through the mother. So I was interested in making this work with three women, three generations, and three countries and three languages. And this led to a whole body of work to do with kind of listening and telling stories. The next one is this one, Mother, Father and I, where for the first time I'm including a man in my work, because a lot of my work was interested in women, not feminist work, but more about, perhaps more women issues. And this time I include my father and my mother and myself, and you see it here, there's two screens, and then, one of the screens cut off, but two screens with my dad and my mom, and me opposite. So here I start to be interested in the Algerian War of independence and the colonization of France in Algeria, and I decided to ask my parents to talk about their life when they were in Algeria. So at the time when they were born in Algeria, Algeria was French, yeah? So I'm asking them to talk about their life as indigenous Muslim Algerian in Algeria, which was France at the time, and then to talk about the immigration to France. So I'm trying to understand for myself, my own identity, why would you win the war against France and become independent and then go and live in France? Obviously it's for economical reasons, the immigrants, to earn money in France, they go back, they go and live in France. But still, for me it's important to hear them telling me Because my generation grew up in France, and you probably know also that France has had a very, very big problem in talking about its relationship to Algeria, and especially its relationship to colonization. So my parents, when we grew up in France, they never told us anything negative, anything bad about their life in Algeria when they were colonized. So for the first time, and as I said, it's again to do with me wanting to pass on the story from Algeria and from my parents to my own children. By the time there, I've got a second child, I've got a son. So this idea again became quite obsessive. I need to tell them because we live in France, and I'm a bit worried that all this Algerian kind of history and identity or tradition will disappear, you know. So I become that kind of this passeuse, this transmitter of that story. So hence why I become really interested in listening to people telling stories. I become a really good listener in that way. So anyway, my parents talk about the experience, and it's kind of really touching, really interesting also, the gender dynamic between my dad and my mom. They talk about, you know, what French army used to do, you know, in the villages, because my parents were in villages, grew up in Algerian villages. And also a very important point, one of the reasons I think a lot of the oral history, it's kind of especially more developed, perhaps in those countries and perhaps in Western countries, is because at the time, still only in the 50s, you know, or 40s, when my parents were growing up, they never went to school. My parents can't read and write, no Arabic, no French. French school wasn't allowed for the indigenous people living in villages. So because they couldn't read and write, they couldn't, you know, they transmitted their knowledge through orally, you know. So, you know, I've got very vivid memory about spending time as a child in Algeria. And my grandmother and my mother will tell us all the time stories, especially every evening around the fire. So I think that's why they develop. Obviously now with, you know, writing and all that and recording and all that, it's not as developed as it used to be. But I wanted to myself listen to the story, but also record them. That was my way of retaining the story, and it was my way of telling the story by putting them into a video and showing them to a wider audience. And I thought it was important because it was about politics, and it was about, you know, this Algerian war that nobody wants to talk about in France, really, or used to anyway at the time. This piece has been shown in Paris and in France quite a lot, and it has had a lot of really interesting reaction from the media, journalists, etc. But nevertheless, it's a piece which is being bought by all the big collections in Paris. So it's an interesting, again, contradiction, whereby on one hand we don't really want to hear and see the type of work, but on another hand we buy it. You know. So something happened in 2003. I don't know if you know, but in Algeria there was a terrible civil war that started in the early 90s and finished, let's say, in 2001, 2002. So during those 12 years, in fact for 15 years, I don't go back to Algeria. I don't go back because it's too dangerous. And my parents, by that time, go back and live in Algeria. They leave France and they decide to go and settle themselves in Algeria. So the only way I can actually see my parents and carry on my work on oral history, meeting them in Paris, which I do. That's the meeting point. So in 2002, the civil war stops. It's less dangerous to go back to Algeria. I go back. And when I go back, something really interesting happens in my work, and that's where you see a big shift in the work, is that I stop doing work which is more documentary, which is more about the family and more about telling stories, into a work which is much more rooted in Algeria. So I started filming and photographing in Algeria. And I replace the landscape, or the family with the landscape. So the landscape or the cityscape or the seascape becomes a metaphor for the family. I know a lot of you know, because a lot of you speak French, la mer, the sea, is la mer, the mother. So a lot of the work kind of takes on to this idea, and this obsession with the mother comes back, but through the sea. Hence why a lot of the work I will show you now has got the sea as the main subject. Here here it's a piece of work that, the first one, therefore, that I shoot in Algiers. Something else happened also around that time. I get a really big commission in London from Film and Video Umbrella for the Photographers Gallery. And with that big commission, I decided to work with a crew. So I won't film anymore. I will be working with a crew, a professional crew, who will film with me. And that meant I could make some work, better quality work, better sound quality work also. The work, therefore, becomes less experimental and less documentary, but much more filmic. So there I'm starting to get interested in this idea of cinema, perhaps. And if you want, at the end of this presentation, we have the time, and if you want, I can show you a few clips of the films, so to give you an idea. So the work becomes much more poetical also. You know, the place of the politics is still there, but it's more gentle and more subtle. But also the work becomes more abstract. It's less, although as a starting point it's about Algeria and the Algerian landscape, it opens up to a lot of different readings. So, for example, in this piece Saphir, it's shot in Algiers, but Algiers has such a strong French architecture that when you see the piece, you do not know you're in Algiers. It's only right at the end you realize that, you know, there are some Arabic writings on boats and things like that. So, and I purposely do that because I want to kind of give the space for people to read beyond Algeria, beyond the French-Algerian situation. But anyway, just to go back quickly about this piece was shot in the port of Algiers and also in a French colonial hotel called Saphir, hence why the piece is called Saphir. And it's, for the first time also, I work with an actor and an actress. A French actress of Pied Noir origin, as we call them, of French settlers origin, and an Algerian actor, a local Algerian actor. And a lot of duality happening. And it's about the sea, and it's about that gazing, and that sea, that Mediterranean Sea, how important it is in the speech of the French and the Algerian, you know. This sea divides France and Algeria, but it connects it also. It connects it because all the time on the boat you've got the Pied Noir that comes back to discover Algeria. There is the immigrant that leaves. There is the children of the immigrant that comes back, like me, for example. So there is that space, that Mediterranean space becomes extremely active and important. So I kind of start making work around that space, that sea. And then the next piece I do after that, it's Middle Sea, which is a single screen piece, where I shoot a film, in film, not on HD video, but in film. It's the first time I use film, which is the boat journey, Algiers, Marseille, Marseille, Algiers. But again, the way it's shot, you never know where you are, because you hardly see the ports of Algiers, nor the port of Marseille. So you're really in that space of the sea, with an actor playing a part in it. It's a very, very meditative piece, but at the same time it's a very powerful piece in the sense that a lot of the footage are about the sea, and as you all witness and experience, the sea can be quite powerful. So the way it's shot in a way which is quite dramatic, in many ways. So that's an installation shot of the work. And then I go to a piece that influenced the work which is upstairs in the office. It's Floating Coffin. Although I love working in Algeria, and it's very important for me, I also interested in working in other places. So in 2008-9, I decided to, because a lot of the work is about mobility, and it's about boats. I decided, not only about boats, but mainly about boats, I decided to look at what I call the death of mobility, the stopping of movement. And for that, I look at graveyards, boat graveyards or car graveyards. And I come across an amazing space in Mauritania, in the north, at the border with Western Sahara, where there is a graveyard of, I would say, between 100 and 150 boats. And literally on the coast, you see hundreds and hundreds of boats just, dying at sea. Some are in the water, some are just kind of rotting away in the... So I became interested in that space. I do a lot of research with Google about it. There wasn't much written about it, so I needed to go and visit the space. Some close-up here. And I realize also that it's an important space in Mauritania because it's a space where all the sub-Saharan Africa are going now in order to go to Europe. In the past, they used to go from Morocco and Algeria to go to Spain. Yeah, they can't go anymore from Morocco and Algeria. So the next point they can go is from Nouadhibou to go to the Canary Islands. I don't know if you know your geography, but it's a much bigger distance, much more dangerous also because it's the Atlantic Sea. So suddenly you get into a totally different kind of relationship to that kind of illegal immigration. So there is that, and there is another thing that interested me about that space. It's also well known for its bird watching. So a lot of people who are interested in looking at birds and bird watching, they go there. So you've got this very interesting, strange mixture of those boats rotting away, static, in the sea and the sun, because for the ones who don't know, Mauritania, it's purely desert and water. There is nothing in between. Yeah. So this desert meeting the sea, which is pretty amazing. So sometimes when the sea goes, you've got those big boats standing in sand, stranded in sand. So it creates some really strange and interesting imageries. So a static place, but also space of movement with those guys who are trying to go, and you can see them looking around, waiting around for that, and the birds that arrive from the north and spend the winter in Nouadhibou. So I decided to make a piece, and today this is my most ambitious video piece because it's 14 screen. It's also uses a lot of speakers, as you can see in the photograph here, that drop into the space. And also a lot of the cables, you don't see very much now because it's not so clear, but a lot of the cables from the screens and from the are showing. So everything is kind of bare in many ways in terms of the, usually as a filmmaker you try to hide all the cables behind the TVs or in boxes. Here everything is kind of part of the work. And then I'll talk a bit later about the photographs. And then talking about a graveyard, the next piece I did, which is a big commission for Qatar, and I mentioned Qatar because it's important for the context of this region, really. I'm invited to do a piece of work, and I decided to do it in a car graveyard. We call it a car's graveyard. Yeah. And there I go and shoot for the first time, actually, in England, where I live, and I find a car graveyard. And I, film and photograph also, but film mainly. I can show you a clip of that. Of course, for me it was important to talk about the situation of the Middle East, or especially for Qatar and all that, and the oil consumption there, and etc. So the work has a voiceover, and it's quite political. It talks about, not only recycling and environmental issue like the previous work, but also about, how cars are used very much and then just dumped when we don't want, and that creates, a very difficult kind of economy in some ways. Added to that, the whole polemics around, the rise of the petrol, etc., etc. So I could go on around that, but we can talk about that a bit later. So yeah, the second piece, video piece around the graveyard, really, but this time with cars and lorries and then in 2010, I shift completely and I go back. And that's for me becoming quite an interesting phase, because I go back to the earlier work, which is around oral history and looking at documentary or interview-like, if you want. But I mix it a bit more with what I call the landscape or the poetics, yeah. And here I work on I do an installation. So some of you might have seen it in Venice last 2 years ago, yeah. And it's looking at the archive. So I become interested in transmission still, but through the archive and through what I call the gardiens d'archives, the image keepers in the case of this lady. And I decided to interview this woman who's Safia Kouassi, widow of Mohamed Kouassi. And Mohamed Kouassi was extremely important in Algeria because he was the only, and I can really say the only photographer who took photograph of the Algerian War of Independence on the Algerian side. Obviously we have seen, and there are a lot of photographs about the Algerian War, but they're always taken by the French, the French army, the French reporter, or by the journalists who were invited by the French at the time. So here we have the only Algerian one, which was in Algeria, taking photograph of that war. So they're extremely important. I mean, you know, in terms of value, as I say, he's the only one. But he died about 10 years ago, and he leaves this amazing archive to his wife, Safia, who's 86, 87 now, and who struggles with the weight of the archive. She's got no children. Transmission comes all the time to her mind. So I meet her, we talk a lot, and we try to think or figure out a way where we can, or somebody, a museum, or the Algerian government, or I don't know, who can bypass the archive and help her preserving it, because what's important is to preserve now, it's to digitalize and preserve. So I start a body of work where I'm looking at, against transmission, as I was saying earlier, through images this time, and what I call a mise en abîme, where me, as a woman artist, I record a photographer about his own transmission. So I transmit his own transmission. So there is a kind of a mise en abîme there. What else can I say about? I mean, this piece is really beautiful. I don't know, for the one who's seen it, you know, you probably noticed, because she's an old lady. She's very fragile and frail. She's extremely eloquent and gentle, and she talks about a lot of love with her husband. You know, there's a lot of love going on there. The love for working at the side of her husband. The love also for having worked as a mujahid, as a freedom fighter on the side of her husband. And also she talks, and for me it's very important, she talks about the role of art and art in general, or culture I should say, and the revolution. How in Algeria at the time, because they didn't have many guns and arms and things like that, how culture was used really to fight the French colonization. So in the video you have a whole passage where she talks about all the French filmmakers, like René Vauthier, etc., who used to come to Algeria and film, who were sided, you know, who were on the Algerian side, obviously, that came and helped. So she talks about photography and culture in terms of arm or tools to fight the war. And that's something that interests me and that I started developing later on. It's culture and resistance, basically. And then, so in that video, there is a whole section which is more personal, where she talks, as I said, about her husband dying, her being alone, being scared because she has no one to transmit the archive, or the Algerian government doesn't seem to be interested, and also the weight, how she finds it difficult, because not only she wants to preserve the archive, she wants the archive to have a long, long life, but also she'd like to show the photograph of her husband, because he's not just a reporter, he's also an artist. So she's struggling with that. So I proposed to her to make a piece of work about her life, about the archive, in order to raise some visibility. I say I can't do much, I don't have the money to help you with archiving, but what I can do is to make a work about that. And then the work will show, hopefully, in many, many places, and hopefully somebody will approach us, a museum or whatever, with money or with means to help her. This hasn't happened yet, but a lot of people have contacted me and contacted her since then to write about her husband and to show the photographs. So who knows, perhaps that will take the archive somewhere. So one part personal, second part it's more historical, so with facts, names, photograph of people he photographed. A lot of them are Algerian, but not only, because in '62 Algiers was the country all the revolutionary group was. So he's got Fidel Castro, he's got Che Guevara, he's got Lumumba, he's got Frantz Fanon, he's got a lot of people that he photographed that you might have heard of. So here again transmission, and I became interested in working with older people also, because this idea of the fragility of memory and what's the truth and is it the truth? It's an interesting question, I think. And also this idea of editing, you know, what does me as an artist choose to show and to keep away? And also when somebody tells a story, what do they decide to say or to keep from themselves? So it's a kind of really interesting area for me. And then it takes me to one of the most, my last project, I think, which is a lighthouse project in Algeria. And here I filmed in two lighthouse projects. Lighthouses in Algeria, all of them been built by the French. So they range from 150 years old to, the last one probably built in 60 or 70 years ago. So I chose to film in two lighthouses, one in Algiers and one in Kabylia in the mountains, just outside Algiers. And here it's a bit of a complicated installation again because it's full screen, plus one, as you see, with a man there, and another one which has disappeared, which is coming there. Yeah, see. So you've got a full screen and two smaller screens. And I do an interview with a lighthouse keeper because I'm interested in this idea that, for example, in the West, lighthouse keepers don't exist anymore. All the lighthouses have been run with computers now. But in Algeria, we still have this job. But I know also that in 10 years or 20 or 30, it's a job that will disappear. So for me, it was very important to record him, again, telling his story and his experience of being a lighthouse keeper. So again, it's about transmission, this time with a man, and a younger man, I should say. But nevertheless, it's important. It's also important for me, the lighthouse in Algeria, because I started doing a lot of work into the archive of the lighthouse, which is a lot of logbooks. Many logbooks in any lighthouse you go in Algeria. And those logbooks are quite interesting because there is two types of logbooks. There is the one of the lighthouse keeper that comes and enters what is done, what is bought, at what time is switched on, so off the light, etc. And also the second logbook, which is a visitor's one. At the time of the French, and even after, visitors will come and visit lighthouse and make comments. Yeah. So I started doing a lot of work around those logbooks. And I noticed something really interesting, that the lighthouse in many ways has been the witness of the transition of Algeria colonial and Algeria post-colonial. Yeah? And you see it through the name of all the lighthouse keepers before 62, they're all French. And as soon as you get closer to see, in fact, from the ceasefire in March, the 8th of March 62, you see already the name of the lighthouse keepers start to be Arabic names. And then 5th July 62, which is the day of the independence, all the name Algerian. So through those logbooks, you can already see that, but also through the handwriting of the lighthouse keepers. And then for the visitors logbook, it's quite interesting just to see the comments, again, before 62 and after 62. So I did a bit of work in the video about that, but also I did a photographic piece of work. Talking about photography, I should say that most of all my video work I do, there is always a series of photographs attached to it. Different, slightly different from the video, but for me it's always important because for me, the two medium that I can separate. You know, for me, I do video, I love it, and I would say that I'm perhaps more at ease with moving image, but automatically I need to do also photography. So often with one body of work, like the 14 screen piece that you've seen shot in Nouadhibou, I've done a series of photographs with it. So it happens all the time. So very quickly, with the piece Saphir I was mentioning earlier, situated in the port of Algiers, I've done a series of photographs of a colonial building in ruins, looking at the disappearing traces of the French life of the time. So again, this idea of the wreck and the ruins comes back in my work. And you know, as you can see here, you know, a lot of the houses have been neglected in many ways, or not looked after by the French government, by the Algerian, government. Especially if you go back to the first house, which is pretty amazing. You know, in Algeria we have a lot of Roman ruin, as you must probably know. You know, North Africa has a lot of ruin, and in Algeria we're very proud of it. The museums, we pay to get in, you know, and they're looked after very well. But as soon as it's, and obviously the Roman colonized Algeria at one point a long time ago, nevertheless, it was a form of colony also. But with the French one, because it's such a recent colonization story, we don't want to care about the ruins. And it begged me the question that in 200 years or 300 years, when we will look at the French colonial ruin, we will probably want them to be in the museum, and people to pay and look at them, you know. And so the fact that they neglect now, then, I think is quite interesting. Because I don't realize the value of it in, you know, and, you know, obviously because it's a very recent past, which is still quite painful, and the relationship with Algeria now, between France and Algeria nowadays is very painful and complex. Therefore, because of that, they can't see the value in such a beautiful architecture, you know. Whether it's French or not, you know, it shouldn't matter really. What should matter is the beauty of the architecture or the interest of the architecture. So here we've got the series of boats that I did in Mauritania. Yeah, it's a different version than the one upstairs, but you still have the lovers, the two one there, which are upstairs. And then I started kind of being interested in object and photography and object. I was getting really bored, I should say, with photography printed on photographic paper, framed, hung on the wall. So I decided to make more work to do with installation and the object, so I started printing images, and here again is the images from the Mauritania into light boxes and starting to play with the light boxes, a bit like cubes, placing them on the top of each other, using the cables, etc. So for me it was a way to kind of move away from traditional photography. Again, here you have another way of displaying the work with smaller light boxes. And then more recently, talking about Qatar and the project in the car scrapyard, I did a huge installation with more than 100 of light boxes piled up on the top of each other. And here you have some close-up. Okay. So, you know, more interesting in object rather than photography now, although, you know, I have to take photographs in order to make the subject, so photography is very much present, but it's, yeah, it just worked in a different way. And for me, the space is very important, and for me, it was very important in the way, and that's why I do a lot of video installation. I find it very difficult to make a single screen installation now, because I want really the audience to move in the space and to interact with one screen or another one. That's why for me to have more than one screen is always more important. And not having to sit to look at a work, it's another thing. I want people to move in the space. And the same with the photographic work, I guess. So that's why, you know, I'm kind of making more object-based or installation-based work. I don't know if I can say much more than that, unless maybe you have some questions, something.
This is very interesting because, yes, in fact, the world is changing a lot.
No.
No. Yeah. So it's one more step. The work is is becoming sculptural. It's really changing. It's a big change.
Yeah, especially for the photographic work, but I mean, even in the video, like floating coffin video with the 14 screen, you can see that I'm starting to be more interested in. Having said that, you know, the piece I'm working now on for Marseille in 3 weeks' time, it's a 2-screen, small screen piece, you know, so it's not always, there isn't a rule that from now on it will only be like that. Obviously it depends on budget, it depends on the space, it depends on the work that I do on the subject matter.
And it's also about photography, yes? The new piece, it's like, so it's still lens-based work and about photography.
Yeah, okay, the work in Marseille, it has nothing to do with Algeria. I've been commissioned by the port of Marseille to do some work with them. And I've decided, instead of going to the port and doing work in the port, to work with a photographic archive that shows images of the port. So it's again, by the archive, a bit like the piece Gardien d'Image. So it's again a mise en abîme. It's a lady talking about an archive and the difficulty of archiving and also the transmission. But that archive is very interesting for me because it's a photographic archive of boats. But it's an obsession. The photographer takes photographs of boats coming in and out. He's like I should say, boat spotter. he goes and spends hours and days, sometimes at the port of Marseille, taking photographs of this. So he becomes a collector of images and boat images, but he's a collector who's collected. So he's a collector, which I quite like this idea. So it's again a mise en abîme, because it's me collecting the images through video about somebody who's collected images, you know. So yeah.
Obsessively.
Yeah, obsessively.
Collecting can become very obsessive.
Yeah.
And in a way, but you have, well, I think you have more passion than obsession for images. Yes, it's.
It can turn into obsession. It can turn into obsession. I mean, something that I forgot to say, perhaps, which is important, and hence why it explained that I'm doing more work about the archive. It's because as an artist myself and having children, I've asked myself many times when I go one day, like everyone, what will happen with my artwork. And my children are still young. I mean, my daughter's 21. But I'm having now to educate my children and explain to them not only the value of art, but also the value of my work. So if I go tomorrow, please don't throw away all the photographs and tapes you find. So, you know, so I had to think about it, and I think every artist, I mean, at one point probably has to think about that, you know. And unfortunately, I mean, we are in a generation where we can't think about it, I think, because it's more out there. People are telling you we need to think about it. But the generation of Mohamed Kouassi or the Baudelaire, that Marseillaise photographer, that generation of the 30s, 40s, 50s, I don't think they thought about it. They were making photographs, or they were painters, or they were, and when they were dead, they were dead. But often it's a wife, which was, I mean, often the man died before the wife. I'm sorry to say that, but this is true. It's often the wife after who kind of take on the archive and create a foundation, or, you know, create some kind of visibility. But often, unfortunately, in the shadow. Husband gets all that, you know, even if he's not there anymore, he still gets seen, the work gets sold and seen. But the woman who is behind the work often, or the children sometimes, who carry on the work of visibility of the archive, don't get mentioned, you know, don't get mentioned really. And for me it was important to give a little homage to all those ladies, you know, who actually carry on the transmission of these works. And without them, at the death of their husband, they could also decide, we leave it, you know, that's it. So for me it was important to say thank you to them, really.
This is really interesting, and it's a big weight to have all this heritage, but it's also an opportunity. Yes, it's a richness to have this. Dicevo, deve essere un grande peso avere un'eredità culturale di questo tipo, quando si tratti di un archivio o che si tratti di una complessità così della storia personale, ma anche una grande opportunità. And this is where your work comes from.
Yes, but with all the question around this idea of transmission, archiving, as I was saying, with all the kind of mistakes, with all the fragility, with all the gaps between, you know, what's said, also with this notion of what is truth, what is authenticity, you know, because when I work with those people and I ask them questions, you know, of course I believe what they tell me. Of course I've got no reason to think, but, you know, for me there is always in the back of my mind, but they're telling me everything, you know. And sometimes they tell me facts, stories, names or dates who are wrong, you know. In the case of Safia, she was saying, this man in the photograph is this person, and then I find out that it wasn't, just because she can't see very well anymore, she doesn't remember also very well, and those things happen. So, but I'm still interested in that, you know, I'm still interested in the kind of the fragility of memory, basically, you know.
Fragility e aleatorietà. Forse c'è qualcuno che ha qualche domanda. Solo una cosa, volevo dire, perché ne abbiamo parlato oggi a pranzo. Zineb sta per affrontare una esperienza che è un'esperienza nuova. Le hanno chiesto un monumento pubblico per un artista che finora ha usato appunto la fotografia, già questo è complicato, un monumento pubblico di cui forse ci vuole dire giusto due parole, perché penso che sia una cosa anche molto sintomatica di quello che sta succedendo in questo momento, almeno in Francia, appunto the public poetry.
Okay, yeah, I've been commissioned for the next 17th of October, a commemorative piece to do with the massacre of the Algerians in Paris on the 17th of October 61. I don't know if you know anything about it, but anyway, there was a big massacre in Paris of the Algerian community, or the people were marching anyway. And for a long time, France didn't want to talk about it. It's only since 5 years they start acknowledging, they accepted that yes, there was a massacre, and they put few plaques and made few stels in places to agree that that was wrong what they did in 61. But for the first time in the whole France, a city commissions an artist of Algerian origin, obviously, to make a public art. So an art work that will be big and that will be permanent. So I've been chosen because I do a lot of work to do with the Algerian War, and also because I've been censored quite a few times in France for the work I've done to do with the Algerian War. The city that kind of commission makes a communist city, therefore they've always been, they always help and kind of the Algerian cause, if you want. So I'm doing this big piece, and it's a public art piece, and I don't do public art, I don't do even real objects, so it's quite challenging. And it's even more challenging because it's commemorative, so it has this kind of added particularity about the work, which is a bit scary, that it has to talk about all the death, all the people who died at that time.
Very challenging. Forse c'è qualche domanda?
I have a very simple question. You said before that your parents were not allowed to learn to write and read because it was not allowed at the time in villages.
It's not that they were not allowed. There was no school for indigenous people.
Okay,
unless you lived in Algiers, in big cities, and at the time there wasn't that many big cities, you couldn't. There was no school. And the Quranic school, there was of course Quranic school, but the Quranic school was seen as places where revolution was taught. So very few people were allowed to go, and they were, far. I mean, my parents, they lived in the countryside, and when I said the countryside of the time, they probably, they were taking donkeys to go to places. So, to go to school was the least of their, So, so they're that generation in Algeria. You still have a lot of them who were not educated, and hence why in '62, when the revolution happened, that became a big problem, because they had like 85% of the population who couldn't read and write, no Arabic, no French. So to try to build and create a new country with so little, it was very, very tough. A lot of the politicians of the time who fought against the French couldn't read and write. That's...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you see, I guess, the movie taken from Camus' book about his past?
Yeah, but which film? I don't know.
It's called in Italian, I don't know, unfortunately, the title is called The First Man. Because it talks actually about his life in Algeria at the time he was born there. And he actually, his mother was very ignorant. And I'm thinking about it. Come on. Yeah. I'm thinking about it now because you were talking about the fact that there was a lot of illiteracy. So it was it's actually quite good illustrating that.
Okay. But I don't know the film, so I would.
I would recommend.
Okay. But Camus has a big place in Algeria in general. Yeah.
Your work is very historical. So what is the difference, or where do you see the difference between a historian and an artist?
Well, hopefully in the way we deal with that history, I think. That's why for me the personal is extremely important. That's why telling stories outside just the framework of history is important. That's why the piece with Safia Kouassi, there is all the personal aspect to it. So it's history, but around that, because for me, history and personal go together. But we often talk about history in terms of factual, in a factual manner. As for me, it's important to always talk about the personal. So in the case of Safia, she talks about perhaps the death of her husband, her love for him. etc. That makes the work less dry in some ways. And I mingle both of them together because through also the death of her husband or love for husband, there is a history within that because it's at a particular time within a certain context, etc. So yeah, that's why I'm different, I think. And also because, I mean, we can always question history, you know, even told by historians, although they don't like that, to be told that it might not be. But for me, as I say, all the flows in the work about that is very important. So unlike the historian, I would say perhaps a lot of the facts in my video are wrong, you know. I'm not sure the historian would say it that loudly, you know. But you know, the piece there is showing in Dublin next month. The one with about the archive. It'd be interesting to.
I'm not so sure that the historian would appreciate your description of it. I think he would consider, or he or she would consider himself a bit more creative.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess it depends on the historian, like it depends on the artist.
Allora, forse Zineb parteciperà a una quantità di mostre nel prossimo anno, fra l'altro a Messina, che sarà Capitale della Cultura 2013, e appunto lei è stato commissionato questo grande lavoro che riguarda il porto di Marsiglia, e quando si parla di porto naturalmente si parla di tutto ciò che arriva e che va, e quindi non soltanto del luogo specifico, e poi ha una quantità di altri mostre. Which exhibition in the next time? Just the main town places.
Bombay, Vancouver, in America also I've got one. I don't know, I can't even think about it. Quite a few places, yeah.
Tenete gli occhi aperti se vi interessa, perché il suo lavoro sarà molto visibile, insomma, nel prossimo anno. Volevo solo dire questo, e noi siamo felici di avere il suo lavoro qua. We are very happy to have your work here. Ora
vogliamo vedere il film?
Vogliamo vedere 2 minuti del film, e poi solo 2 minuti per ringraziare gli altri che sono qui.
Now the question is which film?
Which film? Maybe mother tongue one.
I didn't bring mother tongue, in fact. I can show you Gardien d'Image.
Gardien d'Image.
Or you want to see something more landscape? One. Okay.
One and one, like
okay. So
3 minutes one.
Okay. I hope you can just see.
Luce. La luce.
Spegnere qualche luce.
I hope you'll be able to read the subtitles, but it's in French otherwise, French Arabic. You might not be able to read the subtitle because it's so.
Et je me rappelle, plus je me rappelle toujours ce que mon père m'avait dit. Il m'a dit, tu sais, comment il m'avait dit? Il m'a dit, tu ne peux pas connaître, je ne te souhaite jamais de connaître la solitude d'un vieux.
Okay, perhaps I should show the other.
Et ça fait le temps.
Sorry, I'm going to show the other one
Tu
because
ne peux pas t'imaginer la solitude d'un vieux. Et je te la souhaite.
Sorry, the subtitles are too small. We're going to go for the other one. What did I do now? I made a mistake.
Je l'ai connu, j'avais 9 ans, hein. Donc ça remonte loin.
Ouais.
J'avais 9 ans, et c'est pas parce que c'était un ami à mon oncle. J'étais inséparable. Et comme mon oncle était un grand malade aussi, c'est moi qui faisais les commissions, c'est moi qui allais l'appeler souvent, j'allais lui dire ce que mon oncle voulait. C'est comme ça qu'il venait à la maison, on habitait la Basse-Casbah, il venait voir le malade à la maison. C'est comme ça qu'on s'est connus.
Il avait quel âge, toi?
7 ans de plus, mais 7 ans, 8 ans de plus.
16
ans, 17 ans.
Ah.
Une amitié s'est transformée en autre chose.
J'ai souvenir d'écouter votre caractère.
Le caractère, oui, pourtant on était différents.
Ouais.
Lui, il était plus calme que moi, il était d'un calme olympien.
Ouais.
D'ailleurs, même pendant sa maladie, quand il a eu sa crise cardiaque, tous les médecins étaient étonnés par son calme devant cette souffrance et cette maladie. Alors donc, moi aussi je suis calme, j'accepte beaucoup de choses.
Sorry, I'm just going to take you to a part which is a bit more, you can see some of the photograph at least.
Enfin, اللي توحش يما، اللي توحش بابا، اللي توحش وليدو. C'était le photographe. Là, il est photographe, là, il est photographe, mais il est parti en tant que tel. Alors donc, il était connu en tant que photographe. Le porte-parole, si tu veux, tant que photographe. Tous les ministères qui ont besoin de photographes font appel à lui. Bon, par Yazid, bien sûr, et puis Yazid Londres.
Somewhere else. That's a crucial bit.
Et là, on a commencé le travail avec Raïs qui a écrit les pièces, Mustafa Khatib qui était le responsable de la troupe, et tous les jeunes qui étaient commencé à jouer, à donner des pièces de théâtre. Alors la première pièce de théâtre à Tunis, mon Dieu, tu aurais vu ça, c'était formidable. Alors tout le monde, c'était plein, Tunisiens, Algériens, et tout le monde pleurait, tout le monde a larme à l'œil. C'était très émouvant. Les enfants de la Casbah, c'était la Casbah à Alger, quand les militaires rentraient. Alors là, ils tuaient tout le monde, tous les hommes étaient parqués comme ça, les femmes étaient violées, la vie de cette période, parce que la révolution, c'est pas simplement tac. Il y a tout. On a formé plus d'intellectuels en 7 ans de guerre qu'en 130 ans de colonisation.
I think I need to stop on this one because it's quite a good one. Just Tunisia was extremely important for Algeria at the time because, in fact, people think that Algeria was born in 1962, but no, we had the GPRA, the gouvernement provisoire algérien, which was started in 1954, and it was based in Tunis. So in Tunisia, you had all the ministry of the Algerian the provisoire, the Algerian provisionally government of the time. So Algeria was recognized by some countries, many Arab countries and communist countries from 1954, and that's why all the activity, the revolutionary activity, were based in Tunis, and that's why she talks in the video a lot about Tunisia and Tunis and art in Tunis, and the play, etc. Can show you one more thing. What's the question again? Either C or something? Either C? Okay. I will take you again in a space where it's a bit more interesting. So you can see very different from the other work.
So, thank you so much. E adesso io vorrei ringraziare invece Sabina Grasso, Leone Contini e Nathaniel Katz, che sono qui e che appunto hanno ricevuto la borsa di studio. Non so se vogliono venire e dire una parola oppure dopo. E invece Emilio Fantine e Giancarlo Norese, che sono qui e che sono già stati in residenza. Volete dire una parola? Sì. Come?
Dicevo che vogliamo vincere ancora un'altra volta.
Adesso vediamo. Emilio.
Buonasera, siete? Io sono Emilio Fantin, appunto c'è Giancarlo Norese che assieme a me fa parte di un ensemble, chiamiamolo così, di artisti, siamo in 5, c'è anche Cesare Pietro Iusti, Luigi Negro e Luigi Presicce e da anni facciamo un progetto che si chiama Luca Fauso e siamo stati molto felici ovviamente di aver vinto il premio l'anno scorso perché abbiamo utilizzato il finanziamento per contribuire a questo progetto che stiamo portando avanti negli Stati Uniti con il Museo dell'Arizona e dell'Università dell'Arizona a Tempe, cioè vicino a Phoenix in pratica, in Arizona. E questo è un premio che viene dato per la formazione. Noi abbiamo interpretato questa parola in un senso biunivoco, nel senso che appunto stiamo coinvolgendo una comunità locale lì a Phoenix in uno scambio reciproco, quindi in uno scambio di formazione, per poi dare vita a un progetto che avverrà nel 2013, in novembre, che riguarda sempre questo tema, il tema del 2 novembre, il giorno dei morti, si chiama la festa dei vivi, che riflettono sulla morte, E vabbè, non vi spiego oltre perché non è questa l'occasione, però ecco, volevo sottolineare appunto e ringraziare ancora perché ci ha permesso questo contributo comunque di aggiungere qualcosa.
Spero che avremo occasione di parlarne perché è un progetto insomma molto ricco e molto stratificato e comunque in questo caso si concretizza in una formazione al quadrato, è una formazione che serve a creare un punto di riferimento per un'ulteriore formazione molto lontano da qui, ma insomma ne parleremo. E invece poi abbiamo Sabina Grasso che realizzerà un progetto in Thailandia. È un progetto molto personale, legato forse al sentirsi a casa dove si è, o forse al sentirsi estranei anche quando si è a casa, insomma, ma anche di questo forse parleremo. Leone Contini che realizzerà un progetto che si chiama Italianismi, il sole sorge in Occidente, e qui in realtà un rapporto con quello che ha raccontato Zineb c'è ed è molto forte perché si tratta di riraccontare la storia dell'Italia in Albania e appunto i gap, proprio i buchi. Lui è partito da una mappa che ha trovato in una soffitta di casa, quindi una mappa di suo nonno, e intraprenderà questo viaggio per colmare i buchi che sono nella mappa. Nella mappa sono segnati alcuni punti che riguardano tappe insomma, toccate dal nonno durante la seconda guerra mondiale, e lui andrà a cercare i luoghi che non sono nella mappa, quindi insomma si tratta di nuovo di raccontare le amnesie della storia, o invece il modo in cui la memoria lavora la storia personale. E poi c'è Nathaniel Katz insieme a Valentina Curandi, partiranno per New York dove realizzeranno insomma, una nuova tappa di una biblioteca pacifista itinerante, e anche qui insomma insieme al Center for Book Arts, che è insomma un luogo così estremamente in cui viene svolto un lavoro molto interessante per quanto riguarda il rapporto fra l'arte e il libro, e quindi insomma anche questo è un tema che va approfondito, ma che ha molto a che fare con quello che succede oggi nel mondo reale, quello che viviamo. E loro faranno dei corsi per esempio di legatoria, e quindi la formazione è una formazione a 360 gradi anche in questo caso. Ecco, grazie a loro per essere qui, e grazie credo a noi, a nctm, che consente questi spostamenti, ecco, queste itineranze che sono veramente fondamentali per creare una situazione artistica, o per supportare una situazione artistica in un paese come l'Italia che insomma dal punto di vista invece del supporto pubblico è così, una situazione lacunosa, e che cerchiamo in qualche modo di colmare, e grazie a tutti voi che siete stati qui con noi.
Yes. I think we'll have a drink here. No, because I think we're 50% of the drink here. But we can have drinks here. And then
ci dovevamo alzare.